You are lying in the dark, but you are not asleep. You can feel the weight of the call, that thin, shriveled membrane you were born with, now worn like a talisman around your neck, burning against your skin. You are waiting for the call. It doesn't come as a scream or a whisper, but as a heaviness in your limbs, a paralysis that starts in the chest and forces your spirit out of the body. You are leaving the safety of your bed to march into the fields, armed only with a stalk of fennel, to fight a war no one else can see. If you lose tonight, the crops will rot in the ground. If you die in this dream, you will never wake up in that bed again. This was not a fever dream or a singular hallucination, but a documented reality for hundreds of people in the Friuli region of Italy in the late 16th century. We are accustomed to the standard narrative of witchcraft, the pact with the devil, the broomstick, the bubbling cauldron, and the hysterical accusations of Salem. But beneath that popularized layer of history lies a stranger, quieter, and far more unsettling stratum of folklore. These are the witches who were never supposed to exist, figures found in dusty court records and parish notes who defy the church's binary definition of good and evil. They did not see themselves as servants of Satan, yet they were ground into dust by a legal system that had no language for what they actually were. This is the history of the witches who thought they were fighting for God, right up until the moment the fire was lit. In the late 16th century, in the isolated and mist-shrouded valleys of northern Italy, a Roman inquisitor named Fra Pietro stumbled upon a secret that confused him utterly. He had arrived expecting to find devil worshippers. Instead, he found the Benandanti, the good walkers. This was not a small coven or a lone eccentric. This was a widespread belief system held by peasants who were born with the call, that thin shimmer of amniotic membrane covering a newborn's face. In the folklore of the region, this membrane was not medical waste. It was a draft card. It marked the child as a soldier in an invisible war. Reports from the Inquisition archives detail a ritual that sounds like a fever dream. On the Ember Days, the 4 seasonal turning points of the year, the Benandanti would feel an irresistible lethargy. They would lie down in their beds, their breathing shallowing until they appeared comatose. They claimed their spirits then left their bodies, marching out into the silent, moonlit fields of the Friuli countryside. But they didn't go empty-handed. They armed themselves with stalks of fennel. It seems absurd to the modern ear, a vegetable weapon, but in the symbolic language of the time, fennel was a purifying herb, a pungent ward against decay. In the center of the fields, they would meet the Malandanti, the evil walkers, who were armed with stalks of sorghum and millet. And there, while their physical bodies slept in farmhouse lofts, their spirits fought a brutal and violent battle. If the Benandanti won with their fennel stalks, the harvest would be bountiful. The wheat would rise, and the grapes would swell. If they lost, the crops would rot in the ground, and famine would stalk the valley. The horror of the Benandanti case lies in the interrogation room. Transcripts survive of these peasants explaining, with heartbreaking sincerity, that they were doing God's work. One man, known as Battista, told the inquisitors, "I go to fight for the faith of Christ." You can almost feel the air leave the room as the inquisitors tried to process this. Their theology had no shelf space for good wizards. In their rigid worldview, any spirit that left the body was demonic. There was no third option. For 50 years, the church ground them down. They didn't just torture their bodies, they tortured their identity. The transcripts show a slow and agonizing evolution. In the 1570s, the Benandanti are proud warriors of the harvest. By the 1640s, under relentless pressure to fit the church's narrative, the new generation of Benandanti confesses to attending the Sabbath, to kissing the devil, and to trampling the cross. The Inquisition didn't just catch witches. They successfully converted a fertility cult into a satanic one, rewriting the collective memory of a culture until the peasants actually believed they were monsters. While the Benandanti were being erased in Italy, a darkness of a different texture was rising in the Scottish Highlands. The year was 1662. In the parish of Aldern, a woman named Isabel Gowdy was arrested. Usually, confessions in this era were short and coerced agreements to leading questions. Did you see the devil? Yes. Did you hurt the cow? Yes. But Gowdy was different. She didn't just confess, she performed. Over the course of 6 weeks, without the need for extreme torture, she provided the most detailed, surreal, and terrifying account of witchcraft ever recorded in Britain. She didn't speak of a vague and theological Satan. She described a makel, black and rough man, cold as ice, who beat the women of the coven if they displeased him. But the true horror of Gowdy's testimony is in the surreal imagery she introduced. Images that feel less like religious heresy and more like a lucid nightmare. She claimed the ability to transform into a hare to travel the moors unnoticed. She gave the court the specific chant used for the metamorphosis, a rhythmic poem that still carries a chill when read aloud. I shall go into a hare with sorrow and such and meekle care, and I shall go in the devil's name, while I come home again. The men listening to this were used to simple crimes. Gowdy gave them a complex and much darker universe. She described elf arrows, flint arrowheads whittled by the devil himself. She described the sound they made, a sharp flick, and how she would launch them at neighbors. The terrifying detail is her insistence that if an elf arrow hit a man, he wouldn't bleed. He would simply drop dead, his heart stopping as if flipped by a switch, the skin unbroken. It was an invisible murder weapon, perfectly designed to explain the sudden and unexplained heart attacks of the era. Then, there was the toad plow. Gowdy described yoking toads to a miniature plow made of a ram's horn, driving it through a neighbor's field to magically strip the land of its fertility. It's a grotesque image, a woman in the dark, guiding a team of amphibians through the dirt and chanting curses. Why did she say all this? The records show no sustained torture. No breaking wheel, no rack, just 6 weeks of testimony, each confession more elaborate than the last. In a life of poverty and obscurity, the role of the Great Witch gave her something rare, an audience. The magistrates hung on her every word. She controlled the narrative, even if that narrative led directly to the stake. She built a castle of words, locked herself inside, and set it on fire. If Gowdy and the Benandanti represent the spectacular and the strange, we must pivot to the domestic horror of the English cunning folk. These were local healers, wise women, and wizards found in almost every village in Elizabethan England. For decades, these figures existed in a gray zone. You went to the doctor for a broken leg, you went to the cunning man when your butter wouldn't churn, or when you lost a spoon, or when you felt a sudden pain in your side. They were the essential service workers of the supernatural economy. But their existence relied on a razor-thin margin of safety. The horror of the cunning folk is the horror of the neighbor turning. It is the story of how quickly helpful magic becomes malicious witchcraft when the mood of the village sours. There is a specific artifact that archaeologists still dig up under the thresholds of old English cottages that tells this story better than any book. The witch bottle. Imagine you are a villager in the 1600s and you believe you have been cursed. Your cattle are dying. You don't call the police, you call a cunning man, and he advises a counterspell. You take a ceramic Bartman jug and fill it with your urine. You add iron nails, bent pins, and perhaps a thatch of hair. Then you cork it tight and bury it beneath your hearth, or you set it on the fire to boil. The belief was that the urine created a sympathetic link to the witch's bladder. As the urine boiled, the witch would feel excruciating pain, unable to urinate, burning from the inside out, until they came running to your door, screaming for you to stop. Think about the implications of this. It turns a cottage into a torture chamber. It turns a dispute over a property line into a magical war. The witches caught in this web were often just unpopular elderly women or rival healers. The tragedy of the cunning folk is that they played the game too well. They legitimized the idea that magic was real, that it worked, and that it could be bought. When the Witchfinder General, Matthew Hopkins, rode into town in the 1640s, He didn't have to convince people that magic existed. The cunning folk had been proving it to them for generations. They had laid the groundwork for their own extermination. This paranoia eventually birthed the swimming test, a judicial ordeal that feels like a grim parody of baptism. This was the practice of binding a suspect and throwing them into water to see if they floated. The theological logic was that water, being a pure element used in baptism, would reject a witch, causing them to float. If they sank, they were innocent, though they often drowned. But reports suggest that, for the cunning folk, the terror began long before the water. It began with the shift in a neighbor's glance. The horror here is sociological. The realization that your reputation in the community, your years of helping birth calves and cure rashes, meant nothing the moment the collective anxiety of the village needed a scapegoat. The cunning woman was not a monster. She was a pressure valve for a community's fear. This fear was not limited to the medieval era. It dragged itself, bloody and persistent, into the Age of Enlightenment. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that witch trials were a product of the Dark Ages, but the execution of Anna Guldi happened in Switzerland in 1782, happenings concurrent with the American Revolution and the Age of Scientific Reason. Guldi was a maidservant in the house of a prominent physician and judge. When the daughter of the house began to vomit pins and needles, metal objects that allegedly appeared in the bread and milk Guldi served, the mechanism of the witch hunt roared back to life one last time in Europe. The Guldi case strips away the supernatural veneer and reveals the ugly machinery of power underneath. Modern analysis strongly suggests that Guldi was not a witch, but a woman who had an affair with her employer. The accusations of witchcraft were a convenient way to silence a domestic scandal that could have ruined a powerful man's reputation. The needles in the vomit were likely sleight of hand or hysteria, but the torture Guldi endured was real. She is widely considered the last person in Europe to be legally executed for witchcraft, a witch manufactured entirely by political necessity. This leaves us with a lingering and uncomfortable question. How many other witches were simply inconvenient women, erased by a legal system that accepted spectral evidence as fact? As we step back from these cases, we are left with a composite image that is far more disturbing than any Halloween decoration. These were not women with green skin and pointed hats. They were midwives who knew which herbs could stop a heart and which could save it. They were men who dreamed of protecting their fields from invisible threats. They were storytellers who found power in the forbidden narratives of the land. The terrifying truth of the historical witch is that she is defined not by what she did, but by what the world needed her to be. The court records are not lists of crimes. They are mirrors reflecting the anxieties of the time. When the crops failed, the Benandanti were created. When the religious order felt threatened, the cunning folk were demonized. When a powerful man needed a scandal buried, a witch was found. So, the next time you hear a floorboard creak in an empty house, or wake from a dream where you were somewhere you shouldn't have been, remember the Benandanti. Remember that the line between a dream and a capital crime was once drawn in ink by a clerk who had never stepped foot in a field.